Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
Soybeans are found on dinner tables around the world. Some form of the soybean is found in baby foods, snacks, cooking oils, and many other food items eaten daily. And soybeans provide the protein in the diets for livestock and fish. The Nebraska soybean farmers support research to develop new soy-based products for foods, livestock, and industrial uses through their checkoff dollars. The Nebraska Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Market Journal, television for making agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension, where you can know how, know now. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Elaine Kub analyzes corn and soybean markets. Aaron Nygren shows crop growers how they can monitor water use with soil sensors and evapotranspiration gauges. Greg Kruger explains how cover crops are impacting his crop rotation research. Brad Lubin outlines new rules to country of origin labeling. And Al Dutcher shows an improvement in the latest UNL Drought monitor. Of the top 18 corn-producing states in the country, only North Carolina is finished with its corn planting. But Nebraska is the next closest at 96% complete. The latest USDA crop progress report showed U.S. farmers had put 86% of their corn in the ground, along with 44% of this year's soybean crop. Nebraska is well ahead of the national average with 63% of its soybeans planted. But after heavy storms dropped rain over large portions of Nebraska and other sections of the Midwest, delayed planting now reemerges as a talking point. Elaine Kub is our marketing analyst this week. Markets were closed Monday for Memorial Day, but spent Tuesday making solid gains. The Dow Jones Industrial Average used the day to set a record high, and both old and new crop soybeans surged higher, with the July contract sitting comfortably for a day at least above $15 a bushel. Elaine joined us to dissect corn and soybean market movement on Thursday afternoon. For farmers who aren't finished yet, there's a lot of precipitation falling over Nebraska, Iowa, Illinois. Those three states are really in pretty good condition. How is weather overall impacting corn and soybean markets?
I would say even as late as last week, it wouldn't really even have been a concern, because I was not a believer that we would be losing any acres or that there would be any acres switching. But now that we're getting really close to June on the calendar, there's a pretty big chunk of Iowa that never got its corn planted. So as of last Sunday, it was 15% of Iowa's intended corn was not planted. Same story for southern Minnesota, which is also a very large corn producing region. So they're really in a situation now when you get into June that their crop insurance guarantees are going to start getting trimmed. So they really will be switching to soybeans. And I don't necessarily think that we've lost acres yet, but only this week would you get me to admit that there would actually be switching, because I just don't think that farmers do it that often. But I do think we are probably going to see that in 2013 in that central Corn Belt region.
So to push you harder only in that region?
Probably. I mean, I don't see that there has been, certainly the market has not been pushing for a switch to soybeans for anybody else who's been able to get corn planted on a reasonably normal schedule.
Old crop soybeans have been fairly strong. They spent some time above $15 on Tuesday. They made a really good run here. What's the argument, if you still have some left, between selling and holding old crop?
The argument for holding, I can't make an argument for holding them, particularly because we saw the basis, the local processors here in Nebraska or Iowa really start pushing that basis in a wild fashion last week, and then that seemed to taper off. So I feel like the big push for old crop soybeans was made last week, and obviously you look at that one day on the chart, it was very wild, and it hasn't gone back to test those old highs back above $15 again. So I think the argument for holding on to them is pretty hard to make. I mean, obviously, I'm not wildly bearish on them either, because the reason they are so high is because the processors are making money. These are great crushing margins for soybeans. But I don't have a lot of arguments for holding on to them at this point.
How do you feel about corn? If you can get above $7 on a cash basis, if the basis is strong enough in your area, is that something you would go for, old crop?
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot of arguments for holding on to old crop corn either. I'm a little more bullish on that just because we certainly are going to have to get through several more months, and it will take, there's not going to be an early harvest this year coming in to relieve the tightness of supply from the 2012 crop. So we've got all through summer and early fall that the corn processors, the ethanol plants, are really going to be needing corn and be pushing for it. So if you've got it at home and you think that you can keep it in condition, that's one thing. If you don't want to pay storage fees at a commercial elevator, that's, these are all things that you have to consider, but I would not discourage someone from selling old crop corn today.
I was reading your article on DTN. You were talking about the positions that traders are in, or the positions that they're getting themselves in. What does that tell us about how bullish or bearish they are overall on average?
Well, the really interesting thing, so for all through the winter, the past several months, the really popular thing for speculators to do and for funds to do was to be long the old crop of corn and short the new crop of corn, because it made a lot of sense. There was a shortage of supply in 2012. We're going to have a huge crop in 2013. And depending on where you got in on that spread trade, they made a lot of money. But now they have to unwind it, and we've certainly seen the volume of trade and the unwinding going on out of the May contract and now out of the July contract, but they've still been holding on to these short positions in the new crop of corn and soybeans. So the speculators and the funds are net short, so they have bearish positions on, but no real justification for it at this point. And now we've seen that this week. We saw that on Tuesday in particular. The markets really started to head up because I think there was just a perfect storm, or just a fundamental straw that broke the camel's back of planting news, late planting, wet weather, that finally got just enough bullishness in the new crop markets that hit some buy stops, let's say, from the funds, and we saw explosive higher movement.
I want to ask you a macro question here. Tuesday was a strong day overall. The Dow made a new high. Consumer confidence is up. Home prices are up. But there seems to be that overall nervousness about where the economy goes from here. How does that all play into grain markets or agricultural markets?
Well, it's not really great news for the grain markets or for commodity markets, because we're seeing the dollar come up. It reached some new highs, 3-year highs this past week, and it's down quite a bit today. This is Thursday, and it's down quite a bit today. But overall, the dollar has been very strong, and it's very much tied to this economy, that we're the strongest economy in the world. Whether you can believe it or not, investors certainly feel that way, and they're coming into the dollar, and that pressures commodities. But the good news from a stronger economy is that you can expect to see the American consumer still able to pay for these higher gasoline prices, which sort of trickles back into the ethanol prices, which sort of trickles into the corn market. We are definitely seeing a robust demand for corn in the ethanol industry right now.
Next week, we'll look at wheat markets with North Dakota State Extension economist Frayne Olson. There was major news in the pork industry this week in the form of a transaction between a U.S. pork operation and a Chinese company. China's Shengwei International agreed Wednesday to buy Smithfield Foods for approximately $4.7 billion in cash. As we explained nearly a year ago during our trip to China, the nation is by far the largest pork producer in the world, but it also imports a significant quantity of U.S. pork. While Japan and Mexico rank 1 and 2 as destinations for U.S. exports, China holds the third spot by importing $886 million worth of U.S. pork in 2012. Shengwei's deal is subject to approval by the U.S. Committee on Foreign Investment. In December, we showed you how some crop growers in the state were using the Nebraska Ag Water Management Network to monitor their water use in fields. On average, farmers in the network have reported saving more than 2 inches of irrigation water annually. As planting season wraps up, we thought it'd be a good time to show you how to install Watermark soil sensors and ET gauges in case you're interested in using those instruments this year. The Watermark sensors are placed at 3 depths in the soil at 1, 2, and 3 feet deep. The ET gauge is placed near a field's edge to measure how much evapotranspiration is taking place. UNL Extension educator Nygren recently showed us how producers can install and use these tools to help monitor their crop water use.
For producers in the Nebraska Ag Water Management Network, or NAWMN, now's a good time to remember to get out into the field and get your Watermark sensors installed. First things you need to do is some prep work before you go out in the field. First thing is to find your sensors, soak them in a bucket of water overnight, then take them out and let them dry. You can even put them in front of a fan to let them dry out a little bit quicker, and then re-soak them at least another night. Let them dry out again, and then take them to the field wet. We need to do this process before we go into the field just to make the sensors work better throughout the season. Once you have that done, next thing you want to do is find the location of the sensors that you're going to put in the field. So you want to find a good, easy place to go to, someplace convenient. Along a pivot access road works well, but you want to make sure that that spot is also someplace that's representative for the field. So once you have that spot in mind, then we're going to head out to the field with our sensors. Remember to bring your soil probe along. We need the soil consultants tube. Then we're just going to probe down between our corn or soybean plants, remove that soil, and then just insert the sensor into that hole. Once we have them in the ground, the next thing we're going to do is firm some soil around there and then kind of make a little bit of a berm around that sensor also. We just don't want any water running down the side and messing up our sensor readings. Another thing to remember before you install them is to tip them over just to make sure there's no water accumulated up in the tube. Sometimes we'll get some water up there and that'll mess up our sensor readings for a couple weeks. Be sure to remember to GPS your location where you installed the sensors or bring some flags to mark them. That's a good thing, otherwise you're going to have a hard time finding those sensors as the corn gets bigger. So once we have that completed, you should be ready to read your sensors and just double check, make sure they work properly. They should be reading somewhere close to 0. As long as they're below 5, they should be good. If they're reading above that, it may be time to get a new sensor. So when you have your Watermark sensors installed, the next step will be go back to the field and check them. So usually those, again, we can do them once a week. Some growers like to do it more frequently. There's a couple different ways we can do that. We can use a handheld reader, which is portable. It's also the cheapest method, but then you do have to go out in the field. With that, you're just going to clip on to the 2 different wires. You're going to hit the read button, and you're going to get a value from 0 to 199. The wetter the soil is, the smaller the value will be. The drier it is, the bigger it'll get. The other option for producers is to use a data logger. That data logger is going to record the values for the Watermark sensors every couple hours, so that way they don't have to go out in the field to check them. Then they can also download that information at the end of the season.
Soil water sensors cost around $35 each. The handheld monitor is about $250, and the ET gauge is priced around $225. To see the second half of Aaron's demonstration installing ET gauges, you can go to the Market Journal website or Facebook page. We'll also link to more material about the Nebraska Ag Water Management Network on our website at marketjournal.unl.edu. Compared to this time last year, gasoline and diesel prices are lower in every region of the country except for one. The Midwest is paying 19 cents a gallon more for gasoline and 12 cents a gallon more for diesel fuel than at this point in 2012. On average, the West Coast is paying the highest amount for gasoline at $3.93 per gallon, while the Midwest is paying $3.80. Refinery shutdowns have helped inflate the Midwest's price. During our trip to North Platte a few weeks ago, we saw Greg Kruger's crop rotation study. The research is just getting started as it's only 3 years in, but the goal is to understand the best crop rotation and if different years change what the ideal rotation would be. Greg's study in the dryland fields we saw were of continuous wheat, wheat fallow wheat, wheat corn fallow, continuous corn, and wheat corn corn fallow. There's a soybean combination which plays a role in the irrigated study, as you'll see towards the end of the interview. But before we get to the results, it's important to start by setting the scene of drought in North Platte.
The last 18 months or so have been extremely dry here in Nebraska, and here in North Platte we've been probably near the epicenter of that. So it's been extremely dry here, very tough conditions. We had an extremely hard time getting wheat to germinate last fall. In fact, when we planted the wheat last fall, we held off on planting until much later than we normally would, hoping that we could time that planting right before rainfall and get a little better germination. As you can see, it's still pretty tough. So it's been a tough year and a half, and at this point, even an inch or so probably wouldn't provide us much relief.
Well, that might play into some of the results, but overall, give me some of the major things that are sticking out to you in a few of the rotations.
So one of the most interesting things that we've seen, Jeff, is this last year in the summer, we planted a cover crop into our wheat to corn fallow rotation on part of the plot because we wanted to understand how cover crops have a fit in our dryland cropping systems out here in western Nebraska. And unfortunately, we probably picked the worst of the years to do that. That cover crop did germinate and it did come up. We got the rye and we got the turnips and stuff that come through, but the problem is that it used up what little available moisture that we had. And so it's really made the planting that wheat that we planted into that particular rotation last October even tougher. So in some of these plots, you can really see a difference where we had the cover crops versus where we didn't have that cover crop.
Is it enough to make you say yes, plant them or no plant them, or just something to say keep in mind that there is a moisture content that it will use up?
Well, like any good agronomist, I would tell a farmer that they need to use their best judgment. Or no other researcher is going to explore every single environment and every single soil type and every single scenario. So farmers have to use good judgment when they make those decisions. Because we were so dry last year, making that decision not to plant cover crops here would have been a good idea. But that's not to say that cover crops don't have a place. Certainly not trying to portray that message, but we need to be cautious of when and where and how we employ cover crops, because there are situations where it will come back to haunt us.
I would call you a great agronomist. I wouldn't just call you a good agronomist. I was a great agronomist. What about the wheat-on-wheat rotation?
The wheat-on-wheat's been
rotation,
really interesting as well. You're exactly right. There's a lack of rotation there. And one of the things that's really stood out in that particular rotation, and we can see it in these plots behind us, is that we've got a lot of grass problems moving in. Because unfortunately for the winter annual grasses, that we don't have a good control program chemically. And so it's really tough to get on top of those grasses in that particular rotation. So right here in North Platte, we've seen a huge migration over the last 25 years out of continuous wheat and into wheat, corn, fallow, and some of these other rotations. And that's given us a tool to manage those winter annual grasses. And we've been able to get away from some of those problems. But anytime we have a lack of rotation, we've really set ourselves up for pest problems, and this time we can see it with the grass that we've got coming in.
In the situations where you do have corn in there, are you getting any substantial yield out of it?
So last year was a tough year. In this particular study, the continuous corn dryland was not good. We did not have anything to harvest. In the wheat, corn, fallow rotation, there was some yield there to be harvested. But in the continuous corn, we just didn't have it. So once again, there's a lot of value in crop rotation.
You mentioned you have this in an irrigated situation as well. Is there any difference there?
Yeah, so irrigated, we've got a little bit different rotations. We've got a continuous corn, a continuous soybean, a corn-soybean rotation, and then a corn-soybean rotation. And real interestingly there, when we rotate soybeans into that rotation, we have those bradyrhizobium fixing nitrogen. And last year we saw a little bit of a kick early in the season from that corn growing in that corn-soybean rotation as opposed to the continuous corn. So that's one of the things that's shown up just within a couple of years.
While recent rainfall has most likely helped a good deal of Nebraska's grazing land, the state's range and pasture is in some of the worst shape in the country. New Mexico has the largest portion of its range and pasture in the poor and very poor condition at 91%. Arizona comes next at 66%. Then comes Nebraska and Nevada at 65%. With forage supplies already in dangerously low quantities, cattle producers may have used or be forced to use different types of feed to get their herds through drought. On June 10th, UNL Extension will offer a workshop in person and online on the sustainable use of crop residues on cow-calf and yearling operations. Aaron Stalker explains what topics educators will cover.
We'll talk about how to use crop residues in forage-based beef production operations, so like a cow-calf or yearling operation. And we'll talk about like alkaline treatment, ammoniation, using them with distillers grains. And then a really important part of the webinar is talking about how to do it sustainably. So we'll come at it from a crop producer standpoint as well and talk about any potential subsequent effects on crop yield or detrimental effects will be covered.
You can attend these discussions in person at the ARDC in Meade and the West Central Research and Extension Center in North Platte, or you can watch the presentations online. We'll link to the UNL Beef website calendar if you're interested in more information. Zach Honeycutt believes young farmers like him have an obligation to tell agriculture's story and to get more involved in formulating ag policy. The June Nebraska farmer details how Honeycutt is doing just that as chairman of the American Farm Bureau's Young Farmer and Rancher Committee. Honeycutt farms with both his father and brother near Giltner. He's an active user of social media sites as well, hoping to spread the word to consumers on farming practices. You can read more about Honeycutt in the June Nebraska Farmer. Livestock groups are reacting to changes in country of origin labeling. UNL Extension Public Policy Specialist Brad Lubin talked with us Wednesday about the WTO's ruling against the U.S. and how producers and packers will have to satisfy that agreement.
The new U.S. proposal to come into compliance basically revisits the rules that were written in 2008 that said products that come from a mixed origin can have a label that essentially says a product of this mixed origin. The USDA rewrote the rules last week, and in an effort to come into compliance and in fact return to sort of the original language of 2002, which said we have to specifically know where every cut of meat came from. Not grouping for convenience or efficiency, but every cut, every muscle cut, every steak, every roast specifically has to be labeled for where it was born, where it was raised, where it was processed.
So essentially you could see something born in Canada, raised in the U.S., slaughtered in the U.S. That's what's on the package.
Absolutely. Instead of a label that's has been implemented, which is product of the U.S. and Canada.
All right, so on two sides of this, how do Canada and Mexico like this deal?
Well, Canada and Mexico certainly filed the original complaint because they said U.S. rules were discriminatory against imports. Part of that was because this information is required of all imports, even though the label itself wasn't exactly specific about where it came from. Partly because this information is required of all imports, even though only a portion of total production goes through a retail outlet that has to come into labeling compliance. Canada and Mexico complained, the WTO found in their favor. This is USDA's attempt to come into compliance. Canada and Mexico say it's not yet enough.
Many farm groups don't like this deal either. Main reason being what, the cost?
Well, certainly there's a fear that the cost here outweighs the potential benefits. We can imagine potential benefits if this label sends information and signals to consumers that they specifically want and are willing to pay for. They'll increase demand or they'll be willing to pay more for the same amount of product. But if the cost of providing that information exceeds their willingness to pay, then both producers and consumers lose. And the cost is not specifically how much it takes to print ink on a label, but the records that it takes not just to track a lot now, but to track every single animal, and the potential segregation that we'll see in the processing sector because we can't afford to process animals from mixed sources. We really have to segregate by day or by shift or by plant and change around the logistics of the industry.
Up front, the packers will face the most costs, right?
Well, in the immediate term, the packers have to come into compliance immediately. Basically over the next 6 months of a sort of an educational period, as it's called, packers have to come into compliance and develop a label that says exactly where this product came from, develop the records and the processing segregation system to efficiently deliver this.
This went into effect last week. Where does it go from here? I mean, is there any review here by the WTO in the future?
Well, as per USDA's instruction, it went into effect last week. It's a final rule, and the industry starts to live with it today. Well, this week. As per the WTO, they still get to revisit this. Canada and Mexico both claim that this is still not yet in compliance. They will certainly lobby the WTO to review this and find that it's out of compliance. If it's out of compliance, then we get 6 months into working under a new rule. The WTO could well, in fact, publish a ruling that says it's still not in compliance, and we're sort of back to square one. So we're moving ahead with rules. We don't yet know whether it's a long-term solution.
Storms brought heavy rains in large portions of Nebraska over the last week. Here with his forecast of precipitation over the next several days is UNL Extension State Climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here we are again for the weekly forecast. Before we get to the main forecast, let's take a retrospective look over this last week. And of course, the big news was the active weather that we've seen across a good portion of the eastern two-thirds of the state. We had lesser totals across the western part of the state, and of course we did have a couple severe weather outbreaks in regards to tornadic activity, probably the most widespread tornadic outbreak that we've seen in well over a year. As we look at portions of the eastern third of the state, most locations received anywhere from about 4 inches upwards to approaching 8 inches of moisture. So essentially at least a month's worth of moisture in a 7-day period up to a month and a half to 2 months worth of precipitation. And we've seen the deficits, at least for this year, basically going into the surplus range of anywhere from 3 to 6 inches across the eastern one-third of the state, and that has had a dramatic influence on the drought monitor depiction. You'll notice that most of the central and eastern corn belt now are showing nothing in regards to dryness, not even any abnormal dry conditions. Iowa's sitting basically under a pool of water, and we need to see some drying conditions, and we've seen that improvement across eastern Nebraska. Where we're more concerned is western Nebraska, and then of course down toward the southwest, where we still have a pretty sizable area of extreme to severe and exceptional drought conditions. So we'll need to see further improvement. Now, as we look at today, what we're noticing is that the cool air is starting to filter in behind the trough that was responsible for all of our activity. It's moving toward the Great Lakes, pulling in much cooler conditions. We should see some fairly nice conditions this weekend, be able to open up the windows and enjoy the fresh air. Doesn't look like we're going to see anything in the way of significant moisture. Now, by tomorrow, we'll start to see the ridge trying to approach into our region. A slight warm up, but we're still going to remain slightly below normal. And more active weather looks to be generating early next week as we see another trough diving into the northern plains. This was not coming out of the southwest, so it's not going to have quite the moisture to work with. But as we get into Tuesday, it's going to slip that funnel boundary into northern Nebraska, and we should start to see some precipitation breaking out, with the main event probably taking place as we get into Wednesday as this low moves toward Iowa. That should give us a northwest flow, and we should see some scattered thunderstorm activity. Not nearly as aggressive in terms of precipitation as last week, but we're still looking at some areas of eastern Nebraska that may see in the area of 1 to 1.5 inches, with lesser totals as you move toward the west. As we get into Thursday, we'll start to see that trough kind of petering itself out across the western Great Lakes region, and we'll still have a weak northwest flow, but we'll start to see a warming trend by weekend. And as we get into Friday, we're going to notice the ridge trying to build into our region, and there's still some isolated showers that may occur. So if we look at the numbers, we're basically looking at temperatures are going to be very cool this weekend, a little bit warmer in the southwest. Then we'll start to see that gradual warming trend early in the week, and then we'll see the scattered thunderstorm and shower activity developing during the midweek time period, and then a drying trend establish itself toward the end of the week. Now, as we look to the 8 to 14 day forecast, they are indicating below normal temperatures possible as we get another system maybe moving in next week. And in regards to precipitation, the majority of the heavy precipitation slides to our east. We'll start to see a ridging pattern develop across the west. We should be closer to normal. In a little bit longer term, the models are hinting at a big ridge starting to build from the southwest into the central plains, so the heat might be turning itself on as we get into the mid-June period.
Thanks, Al. Our interviews from today's show with Elaine Kub, Greg Kruger, Brad Lubin, as well as Aaron Nygren's demonstration on installing soil water sensors are archived individually on the Market Journal website as part of the May 31st episode. Next week, Frayne Olson will be our marketing analyst, and Lauren Giesler will take a look at soybean seedling diseases. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension, where you can know how, know now. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
Animal agriculture is vital to Nebraska. Livestock production not only contributes to our food supply, but also helps our rural communities. Livestock provides revenue for schools, creates jobs, supports Main Street, and enhances the future for farm families. The Nebraska Soybean Board's Animal Agriculture Initiative works to encourage growth of responsible livestock enterprises to benefit agriculture and Nebraska.